Well, in Unit 1, we're really focusing on how we got our New Testament, right? How do we have these 27 books in the New Testament? So in the last video, we considered the canon of the New Testament and how the church came to view these 27 books in particular as inspired, and why consequently we treat them differently from other books today. But we're going to continue trying to answer that question of how we got our New Testament by looking at two different things. The text of the New Testament and translation of the New Testament. So when we talk about the text of the New Testament, we're talking about the field called textual criticism, and then we'll also get into translation theory a little bit as well. So some of this lecture will track with a little bit of your textbook reading, though I'll add some things and hopefully give you some more context here from How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Fee and Stewart. But as they look at these two issues, they talk about sort of the Bible as our basic tool, right? And so they note that the Bible was originally written in three different languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Again, most of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, with just portions of it being written in Aramaic, and then, of course, the New Testament is written in Greek as well. And so they recognize that the vast majority of people need a translation. And actually, I think an important point for us to consider is to read in a translation is not a bad thing. Some of you will take Greek and Hebrew here with us, and you'll learn to begin to read the Old Testament in Hebrew and the New Testament in Greek, and that's great. I'd love for you to take Greek with me, for example. I think it's a valuable use of your time, but we also recognize that for the vast majority of Christians, they've been reading the Scriptures in a translation for all of their lives, and so we actually want to argue that that's not a bad thing, that translations are a good thing. But we do want to get to these questions of, well, how did we actually get to our New Testament? So if you look at this chart just briefly, here you see on the left side sort of three big frameworks, I guess, if you will: inspiration, transmission, and then translation and interpretation. So let's think through this process. We start with the divine author, right, who inspires the human author. So God inspires Moses, Paul, the other authors of the Old Testament and New Testament. And that leads to an original text or scripture, right? So this would be the process of inspiration, where God inspires the human author to write in Greek or Hebrew the words that are now a part of our scripture. But then from there, we have lots of copies of the original text. We'll see more on this in a moment, but we don't actually have originals of any of the writings of the Old Testament or the New Testament. So part of this process is, once Paul writes, for example, his letters are sent to many different churches, so copies are made and copies of copies are made, because this is valuable, right? And the church is using it and wanting to spread Paul's letters so that other churches can use them. So this is part of the process that you see here that's called transmission, right, where we have an original text and then copies of that original text are made. And that comes to a critical text. We'll talk about how we get there in just a moment when we look at textual criticism. But then we get to a Greek text like what would be the United Bible Society text or the Nestle Aland text, which is what you would use if you study Greek with us to do your translations from. So essentially, that process is these editors comparing all of these different copies and trying to get back as best they can, at least, to that original text. From there, we begin the translation process. So that was the transmission process. And now we have the translation process, where a translator, or preferably a team of translators, translates from Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek into English or whatever other language they might be translating into today, and then that comes to us as the modern reader. So that's just a helpful, I hope at least, snapshot of how we go from even this process of inspiration through to the process of transmission and then to the process of translation. Let's look at this a little bit more directly, though, because Fee and Stewart argue rightly that translators must make two kinds of decisions. The first kind is a textual decision. So this textual decision is, what's the actual wording of the text? What words are a part of the original letter of Galatians or 1 Corinthians or whatever New Testament book that we're looking at? I mean, think about this for a moment. A lot of people don't appreciate this always, but there's copies being made by hand for hundreds of years up until the 1500s. If you were to sit down and even just copy Mark, the shortest gospel, by hand, the odds are your copy is not going to be perfect. You're going to make some type of copying error along the way. So these copies aren't all the same. Many of the differences are accidental, very minor differences, but they're not all the same. So one decision that a translator has to make is, what's the actual wording of the text, comparing all of these manuscripts through the process of textual criticism. But the second question they have to answer is, how do I translate that word? Once I know what the Greek or Hebrew word is, how do I render that Greek or Hebrew word into an English word? So again, let's think first about this question of text. So again, this is a question of what Hebrew, Greek, or Aramaic text or even individual word is the right one. So again, no original copies of the books of the Bible are in existence today. We call these the autographs, but we just don't have those. This is not actually surprising. We don't have them for any ancient documents for lots of different reasons, really. Papyrus not being a very durable material, for example, things like that. So this is actually true of ancient documents by and large, not just the Bible, right? But we do have thousands of hand-copied manuscripts from really into the 2nd century all the way up until the time of the printing press, and even some technically after that. Later manuscripts often significantly differ from early ones, right? You've seen your textbook talk about this. So just a few notes on types of manuscripts here. So papyri, these are manuscripts written on papyrus, which is an early form of paper made from reeds, prominent in areas like Egypt. So we have papyrus manuscripts from as early as the 2nd century. And we have 131, and this number does change from time to time as new manuscripts are discovered. But we have well over 100 of these papyrus manuscripts, again, written on this paper made out of reeds. And these are among our earliest New Testament manuscripts. Majuscules, these refer to manuscripts written in all capital letters. I'll show you a picture of this in just a moment, but the earliest manuscripts we have, including many of the papyri, are actually manuscripts written in all capital letters. So these majuscules, now written on things like parchment, occur from the 4th to the 8th century. So even going back to the 4th and 5th century, we have very complete or almost complete copies of the entire New Testament written in these all capital letter forms, things like that. Later manuscripts fall into the category of what we call minuscules. These are manuscripts often written on parchment in lowercase or cursive letters. You see almost 3,000 of those. So again, we move from this all caps to lowercase, even something that would look almost like cursive to us today. And then finally, we have lectionaries. These are books of biblical readings to be used in church services, so they're not necessarily going straight through the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Mark, but they include biblical texts and would have been how the church would have organized sort of their lectionary or readings throughout the course of the church year. So you add these up, and we have over 5,000 independent witnesses to the text of the New Testament that occur over the periods of hundreds of years, going all the way back from the papyri, our earliest ones, into these majuscules, minuscules, and then into our lectionary. So here's an example of this. This is a picture of Codex Vaticanus. You can see at the top, this is the beginning of the letter to the Hebrews, the book of Hebrews. You can see, again, if you know Greek, you'll see that these are all capital letters. You'll notice a couple of other things. No spaces between words, no spaces between sentences, paragraph, things like that. Just sort of straight capital letters, which does actually make it somewhat difficult to read. This is not what our modern editions of the Greek New Testament look like, which have sort of English, style punctuation, different things like that. So this is an example from a pretty early, fairly complete copy of the New Testament and what it would have looked like. So again, we go back to the question of the text, and translators and other scholars use what we call textual criticism to reconstruct the text. So let's think about that for a moment. Again, this claim that we're making, why are they reconstructing the text? Well, because from that original text, copies and copies and copies and handwritten copies are made for hundreds and hundreds of years. And then we have these some 5,000 or 6,000 copies plus copies in other languages and a host of other evidence that aren't all exactly the same. So the science of textual criticism is comparing all of these copies and trying, in part at least, to get us back to, as best they can, that original text. So textual criticism is a science that uses careful controls. It weighs what would be called both external and internal evidence. So external evidence would be external to the text of the manuscript. So these would be things like the quality and age of the manuscript. Think about that for a moment. You can, by reading a certain manuscript, begin to tell if this is a better scribe or not quite as good of a scribe, right? In the same way that if we were to do that today and we asked 100 different people to hand copy the Gospel of Mark, we would probably see that some of those had fewer mistakes or errors in their copying process than others. Others would include like the date of the manuscript. How early is it? Is it from the 300s? Is it from the 1200s, right? That's obviously going to probably affect how we would sort of weigh that evidence. Internal evidence would be the tendencies of copyists, right? So we've already talked about this internal evidence of how the scribe copies, right? Do they tend to make the same kinds of mistakes? Do they tend to copy in the same sort of way? Does it fit with what we find in the rest of the Gospel of Matthew? Different questions like that. So external to the text itself and then internal to the text would be two types of evidence. So the best external and internal evidence yields a high degree of certainty about the original text. This is what textual criticism, again, is doing in part, is comparing all of these manuscripts and saying this is very likely the original text as coming from Paul, Matthew, whoever it may be. So I'm going to use 5 steps for evaluating readings. This comes from Andrew Naselli's How to Understand and Apply the New Testament. I'm not necessarily asking you to memorize these steps or anything along those lines, but I think it'll be helpful for us to look through what would it look like for a particular variant, is what we would call it, a particular example of a question over what the original text is. What would it look like for us to evaluate that and see what the original text is? So he argues that first is to understand what the different kinds of variants are. So he would argue that there's insignificant, significant but not viable, and significant and viable differences. A whole host of things would fit under this category of insignificant variants. These would be things like just simple spelling errors. This would be just when a scribe just restarts back at the wrong point of the manuscripts and just makes a simple mistake, as maybe he is going from one text to the other, possibly. These would be errors that we clearly know are errors, right? And we don't really have any question that they might have been part of the original text. Significant errors, most of those insignificant errors don't affect sort of any doctrines or anything like that. They're really just easy misspellings and things like that. Then would be significant but not viable is a category he has. In other words, these would sort of matter to our text, but they're very unlikely to be original. And then significant but viable would be this category of significant variants. They do make a difference in the text and even the meaning of the text sometimes, and we have some questions over the original text there. This is just an example. I use a lot of some of the kinds of errors that are made in copying. This is just an example of what can happen. So if you look at the left-hand side, this would be the original text. Notice in purple you see the word public there, which it occurs twice at the end of a line. And that green text is essentially text that would be left out because the scribe's eye jumped from the first use of public to the second. So if you read the whole original text, my father had filled several public situations with honor and reputation. He was respected by all who knew him for his integrity and indefatigable attention to the public business. Now, presumably what happens is a scribe is copying this. He sees the word public, goes and writes to the end of that line. He goes back and his eye jumps to the wrong use of the word public, and we get this text on the right-hand side, and my father had filled several public business. Well, even we have some grammatical issues there, right? But essentially, we can pretty easily see the error that the scribe made. Would this be a significant error? Yeah, in some ways it would. It would change the text, right? But it's not viable. It's pretty easy for us to determine what the original form of the text would be there. There's other examples of errors that are very, or discrepancies that are very small, but make some meaning in the text, but not a huge meaning in the text. Here's an example from 1 Thessalonians 2:7. You see at the bottom of the screen there, this is a difference between a Greek word, nepioi, and apioi. Even if you can't read Greek, you can see the similarities. The only difference is the first letter of the word. that Greek "new" there. But you can see some of the differences in the translations here. So the Holman Christian Standard Bible says, although we could have been a burden as Christ's apostles, indeed we were gentle among you, as a nursing mother nurtures her own children. But listen to the net. Although we could have imposed our weight as apostles of Christ, instead we became little children among you, right? You see the difference there is, were we gentle or were we little children? This is just the difference between those two Greek words, nepioi and epioi, right? You see the ESV says, but we were gentle among you like a nursing mother taking care of her own children. So is this a significant variant? Well, it does change the text in some way, but it doesn't really change the meaning of the text, right? This idea of gentleness and a nursing mother with a child is there in the text no matter what. So even if we have a disagreement over what exact Greek word is used here, it doesn't really change the sense of the text at all. So to go back to real quickly, he's just arguing first step is understand the different kinds of variants. Is this an insignificant variant, significant, viable, significant, and viable? Excuse significant but not viable, significant and viable, sorry. So the second step is to understand how to read the textual apparatus. So for some of you guys taking Greek especially, you'll have a copy of the UBS Greek New Testament or the Nestle Aland Greek New Testament. But so here you'll see an example of a disagreement between manuscripts over John 7:53 through 8:11. This is the story of the woman caught in adultery. And what's happening here is this Greek New Testament is giving us lots of evidence as far as whether or not this story is a part of the New Testament. So you see it gives it an A rating, first of all, which means that the UBS thinks that this is highly likely not part of the original text, almost certainly not part of the original text. And you see a whole list of manuscripts that here omit this text. So P66, P675, these are papyri, very early manuscripts. These, notice this uppercase writing here. These are those majuscules that we talked about earlier. A lot of those 4th century into the 8th century, some very important manuscripts here. B would be that Vaticanus, the copy that we looked at earlier, right? Lots of, here we see this Italian and Syriac versions that also don't include this, Coptic, different things like that. Here's some reference to some church fathers who also seem not to include this story. Then you see those that do include the story. Here we have one majuscule here. These numbers here are these minuscules, these cursive or lowercase documents here. Some references to some other church fathers, right? So we're seeing that there is some disagreement here. Here, some include the story of the woman caught in adultery, but with asterisks, right? Some include it in other parts of the New Testament. Here we see in John, other places in John, some even include it after Luke. So that's just a brief summary of the evidence where we see lots of our New Testament manuscripts don't include this story in their copy of the Gospel of John. Some of the church fathers don't seem to have this in their copies of John. Some later manuscripts do have it, but some manuscripts even have it in different places. So that's how we would look at this apparatus to sort of help us determine the evidence. So now we're going to weigh the evidence. So a couple of different criteria here. Again, we're asking questions like internal and external evidence, right? How old are the manuscripts that have it versus the manuscripts that don't have it? And we even see, as we look through that evidence, that the oldest manuscripts don't have the story in there, which is a piece of evidence for us to consider there. Other things for us to look at are criteria that he would give us: prefer the harder reading and prefer the shorter reading. So in other words, it might sound strange to you to prefer the harder reading, but the principle behind this is the scribes are generally going to smooth things out rather than make them rougher, right? And so the most likely reading is going to be the more difficult reading. They also argue that scribes tend to add rather than take away, generally speaking at least. So the shorter reading is more likely to be the original reading rather than the longer reading. So in this case, of course, not having the story of the woman caught in adultery would be the shorter reading here. So again, we also want to look at some other evidence. If you were to just read through the Gospel of John, it really does make sense without this story in there. I won't go to this too much in detail, but you could go straight from 752 to 812, and if we take that story out there, it seems to have a very natural or logical flow where Jesus is dealing with the Pharisees in particular in verse 47. Then we jump to verse 13. He's still dealing with the Pharisees, which sort of makes sense without this story included in between, where we have a change in scene and different things like that. So these are some of the kinds of evidence that we're considering. So fourth, we want to weigh the external evidence. We've already seen some of this already, right? What's the date and character of these witnesses? We've already seen that the older witnesses tend not to have it. What text type is it? That's not something we have time to go into. You can study more on that later. We actually offer a course in textual criticism here if you're interested in knowing more about that. Is it geographically widespread? So in other words, is the omission of this like spread throughout the course of the church? If we go back, we see here old manuscripts tend not to have it. Church fathers from a range of different places don't include the manuscripts, things like that. And so fifth, we want to consider arguments by textual experts on textual criticism. Here's what D.A. Carson says about this. He says, although most of the scriptures that include the story place it here, i.e. at 753 through 811, some place it instead after Luke 21:38. Others place it after John 7:44, John 7:36, John 21:25. So the diversity of placement confirms the inauthenticity of these verses, if I can say that. Finally, even if someone should decide that the material is authentic, it would be very difficult to justify the view that it is authentically Johannine. So again, Carson is basically arguing the point that this is not a part of John's original text. So again, I know that's a lot, not something I'm expecting you actually to memorize that five-step process, but I do just want to give you a quick view of how New Testament textual critics view these kinds of things. We have a really sort of internationally known Center for New Testament Textual Studies here. So if you ever want to know more about that, you can come. If you have opportunities, visit the Bible Museum here on campus, things like that. Lots of work being done in the field of textual criticism here at NOBTS. Just a quick note on the King James. This is in your textbook, so I won't make much of it, but when the King James was translated, the best Greek text available was from later sources. So most of your modern, really almost all of your modern English translations are going to be based not on the Textus Receptus, which was what the King James was based on, but are going to be based on newer Greek critical texts like the UBS text or the Nestle-Aland text. So a lot of the differences that you see between the King James and your English translations, some of them are just going to be translational, right, using older English words, but some of them, like John 7:53 through 8:11, are going to be textual issues because they're translated from different manuscripts or different Greek texts, as it were. All right, that's a little bit on textual criticism. I know we need to keep moving here because I also want to get us into this question of language. So remember that Fee and Stewart argued that there's two questions that translators have to answer. One, what's the exact text I'm translating from? We've seen a little bit about that. Then secondly, well, how do I translate this Greek text into English? And so what choices do they make here? So a couple of technical terms that I think would be good for you to be familiar with. One would be the original language. That's pretty common sense for us. For in the New Testament, that's going to be Greek, right? The language in which the text was originally written. But then receptor language, the language into which one is translating the Hebrew or Greek or potentially, of course, Aramaic, right? So for most of us, that would be English, but obviously we may be reading the Bible in other languages that we are fluent in. So the receptor language is simply be the language we're translating the original language into. Again, for most of us, probably English, presumably. So there are some technical terms here, some different translation theories. So one, formal equivalence. So we'll call this a more word-for-word translation that attempts to stay close to the original language. So again, there's really no such thing as a word-for-word translation, and I'll show you an example of why that is in a moment. But formal translations tend to be more word for word. They tend to focus on the structure of the original language, sometimes even more so than the structure of the receptor language. A functional equivalence translation would attempt to keep the meaning of the original while also rendering it into normal English idioms, creating more of a phrase-for-phrase translation. So again, it's focusing more on the receptor language. So formal equivalents would focus more on the original language and the grammar and syntax of the original language. Functional equivalents would focus more on the grammar and syntax of the receptor language. So translation theory is the degree to which one puts primary emphasis on formal or functional equivalency. And you'll see that translations exist on a spectrum, as we'll see in a moment. So let's look at some examples of this. This is, again, just an easy example. This is what we call an interlinear, where we just give one English word for every Greek word. And just as an example to show you how there really is no such thing as a word-for-word translation. So if we were just to substitute an English word for every Greek word, our English translation would say something like this: and rebuked it the Jesus, and went out from him the demon. When it was healed, the child from the hour that. Right? So this just shows you that Greek word order and English word order just don't work the same. Just to look at that first line, two things stand out to us. One, Jesus is the subject of the verb. So in English, we have to move Jesus to before the verb, and we'd have to say, and Jesus rebuked it, right? Because in English, the subject has to become before the verb, but in Greek, it doesn't. Another easy thing for us to note there is that Greek uses the article with proper noun, so the Jesus. Well, we don't say it that way in English. We don't put an article with a proper noun in English. So we wouldn't say the Jesus, because that's not how English works. And so you see, there really isn't such a thing as a word-for-word translation, but all these translations are trying to do a good job of communicating the original text in a way that communicates that meaning in good English. Some other examples here that show you some of the differences. So the ESV of 2 Samuel 18:25 says, if he is alone, there is news in his mouth, which is kind of a Hebrew idiom there. News in his mouth. The Net takes that and says, if he is by himself, he brings good news. So they're translating that a little more idiomatically of what they think the sense is in English. You see the NRSV, if he is alone, there are tidings in his mouth, similar to the ESV there. Another example from Matthew 5:2, the ESV, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, whereas the NET just has, then he began to teach them, saying. Similar to the NRSV, then he began to speak and taught them, saying. So again, the ESV is very close to the original language there, a more formal translation. If you look at the actual words of the Greek text, the Net would then be more functional, right? Taking that Greek idiom, and he opened his mouth, and translating it into what they consider to be more natural English, then he began to teach them. And you can see, again, some of the differences there and why we would have these different. You wouldn't naturally speak of someone today, a pastor at your church, for example, and say, well, he opened his mouth and began to preach to us. You wouldn't, that's not a normal English idiom, so the Net comes along and translates that a little more idiomatically. Just some other examples here. Proverbs 11:13, whoever goes about slandering reveals secrets, but he who is trustworthy in secret keeps a thing covered. So if you look at the New Living Translation, that keeps a thing covered. Look at that second line there. But those who are trustworthy can keep a confidence. So keep a thing covered. The New Living seems to think that this isn't sort of a natural English way to say this, and so they translate this keep a thing covered as keep a confidence. Keep the secret in confidence, right? And the message is very loose, I guess, in some ways here. A gadabout gossip can't be trusted with a secret, but someone of integrity won't violate a confidence. Just one last example here. The ESV, for by so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. The KJV, is a very formal translation, said, shall heap coals of fire on his head. Here the ESV is actually a little bit more functional than the KJV, where it says burning coals rather than coals of fire, which would be something of a more natural English way to say that. So if we look at this, comes from Andy Naselli's How to Understand and Apply the New Testament. These translations exist on a range. He says they're more form-based. So the KJV, NKJV, NASB, very form-based. RSV and ESV, pretty form-based. These mediating ones, he puts the NIV there. Close to that is the CSB, the Net. And he puts as more meaning-based. This is where we would say much more functional for us, right? is the New Living Translation is a very functional translation. And then free, I don't think he would necessarily put these into the category of translations, but the Old Living Bible and then the Message, he would categorize as more freer, almost in the category of what we would sometimes call a paraphrase. So again, you see that these translations exist on something of a spectrum between formal on the one hand and functional on the other hand. Just a few things for us to consider. Some typical problem areas in translations. Some things come up a lot. Weights, measures, and money tend to be a very common problem. Think about this for a moment. Think about even the translation of like a denarius or a talent, for example. So in the parable of the talents in Matthew chapter 25, some English translations will just sort of what we would call transliterate the Greek talent, right, into English talent. And the question then becomes, well, how much money is that? And so us as English speakers aren't naturally going to recognize, well, how much money is a talent? Is it a lot? Is it a little? Is it more than a denarius, less than a denarius? So we might not naturally recognize that a talent is a lot of money. And so some translations will say things even like bags of gold or something along those lines to communicate to us that this is a lot of money. And this, of course, gets into problems with inflation and things like that. If you were to try to put a dollar amount on that in, U.S. dollars, for example, that's going to change over time and really quickly date your translation. So weights and measures, money, things like that. Idioms and euphemisms, talking about covering your feet, for example, in the Old Testament, those kinds of things. Word plays are notorious difficult to translate. One example from John 3, where there's a Greek word anothen, which can mean either again or from above. And so in John 3, Nicodemus is talking with Jesus about this new birth, this second birth, right? And I think Jesus makes this word play in this Greek word because the Greek word can either mean from again or from above or again, and that's what Nicodemus misunderstands, right? He takes it as again, not from above. So there's this confusion over how can I be born again? Well, that word play that's there in the Greek text is just really hard to translate in English because we don't have a similar word that can mean either one of those things in English. Then there's matters of gender as well, this issue of gender-inclusive translations, but do we translate some terms as brothers or brothers and sisters, right? Does the English term brothers encompass men and women in the same way that adelphoi, the Greek word, would have, right? So you can read more on these gender-inclusive translation debates, but those are just a few areas where we see some difficult places that are very commonly difficult to translate, not just from Greek to English, but really across a wide range of languages there as well. So that's just a little bit on, again, this question for our Unit 1, which is how did we get our New Testament from canon all the way through to translation, to the English translations that you have in your hand today. So hope that's helpful to you. We'll deal with some more questions about this later, but I hope that's helpful for you to think through how we arrived at our text of the English New Testament.